Manly Hall official, is glad to produce, publish and offer. The Teapot of Mandarin Wong. It was a small room, but its furnishings were in keeping with the estate of its owner. The walls were richly tapestried, and the subtle odor of the East pervaded the room. In the middle of this interesting apartment, every drapery of which seemed to enfold Oriental mystery, stood a carved table of teak inlaid with mother of pearl designed in the forms of beasts and birds. In the center of this table stood a teapot of rare Chinese porcelain. It was an old teapot, diamond in shape, and its long nozzle was formed of the beak of a bird pointed at an outward angle. The handle was of twisted rattan, and from the air hole in the lid a thin stream of steam was rising, and the soft aroma of steaming tea buds, the first picking of the great crop, filled the air. The apartment was without a light save a wonderful silken lantern, hung with tinkling hells and cut glass, which sent a soft shaded light over the table, leaving the corners of the room in impenetrable gloom. At the table sat 3 Chinamen, before each a tiny porcelain cup filled with the almost colorless tea of China's best. The first was a middle-aged man, the son of Mandarin Wong. He was inclined to be heavy in stature, and his long black coat stretched over a ponderous front. His slanty eyes were gazing at his cup of tea, and long yellow fingers toyed with the carvings on the tabletop. His face was immovable, and no sound escaped his lips. The second was an older man of slender build with massive brow. His hands were folded in his lap, and the red tassel of his cap hung before his eyes, which you did not at first notice, so abstracted was his manner. They shone like those of snakes. Once he lifted his hand and stroked the drooping black mustache, the corners of which hung down over his mouth. The third member of this party was a very ancient Chinaman whose wizened features and leather-like skin told that the years were heavy upon him. His hair was grayed, nearly white. In one hand he held his cup of tea, while in the other was a long, thin Chinese pipe. For a half an hour these 3 had sat together. No word had passed their lips, while cup after cup of tea alone proved that they were living things and not statues of ancient wood. They had met for a very important work. 2 of them had come that justice might fall upon the head of the third, who had in the silence of the night strangled with his cue Mandarin Wong, whose body lay upon a couch a few feet away. One of them had slain this mighty Chinaman, whose power in the Orient was without limit, and whose estate and were bordered only by the wall itself, and whose grandsires lay buried beneath the mighty tomb of the Ming emperors. If you're enjoying this video and finding value in the content, we kindly ask you to take a moment to subscribe to the channel. A large portion of our listeners and viewers haven't subscribed yet, and by doing so, you'll help us grow and continue bringing you more high-quality audiobooks. Your support means a lot to us, and it's just one click away. So, go ahead and hit that subscribe button to stay connected and never miss out on our latest releases. Mandarin Wong was the last of a mighty line, and now he had climbed to the celestial lands upon the cues of his ancestors, while these 3 sat in silent vigil that the justice of China might be fulfilled. No word passed their lips, no sound broke the stillness. Slowly they sipped their tea, each knowing in his soul that one of them was a murderer. The old Chinaman leaned over and poured another cup. Even this motion seemed to startle the other 2, for they moved slightly and seemed to waken as from a sleep. Silence again descended, unbroken, as these three strange figures remained silhouetted by the gloom of the surrounding room, bathed in a pale yellow light from the swaying lantern. Suddenly the silence of the room was broken by a soft footfall. There was a slight squeaking sound, then a miracle happened. From his couch of death, buried beneath a wealth of Chinese silk, rose Mandarin Wang. The aged Chinaman, his frame broken by the weight of years, leaning upon a heavy staff, walked slowly across the room and seated himself upon the great carved dragon chair facing the three Chinamen. They gazed stolidly at the figure and continued to drink their tea, for they knew that the ancient law of China was to be fulfilled, as the dead would walk in the midnight hours to condemn their murderers. Mandarin Wang sat facing them for several seconds, his long fingernails upon the edge of the table. Around his neck was a mark of purple where the rope of human hair had strangled out his life, and in his eyes was a strange glazed look which seemed to see nothing but which gazed beyond the skyline of the infinite. Slowly the Oriental with the drooping mustache reached down to a shelf beneath the table and drew from it a tiny cup of chased porcelain. Picking up the great teapot, he filled it and sat the cup with its steaming contents before the shadow of Mandarin Wang. You could have heard a pin drop in the room, it was that silent. The aged Chinaman lowered his head, and his fingers, laden with jade rings and ornaments of old gold, picked up the tiny cup and drank with the three living men. Silence was as yet unbroken, and with the great stoic power of the East these three waited for their condemnation, for one of those with whom the old Chinaman drank had slain him a few hours before. The three gazed on the specter, not even the muscle of an eye moving, as the old man leaned over and with his nimble hands poured another cup of tea. The minutes passed as the four drank from the little cups, the low sound of their breathing the only thing that broke the silence. Suddenly Mandarin Wang extended his hand, and it closed over the handle of the teapot, which stood on a tiny taboret of carved ebony. His long yellow fingers rested upon the pot, then slowly, so slowly as to be almost imperceptible, his hand moved, and with it moved the teapot. Softly it turned, its nozzle directed first to one and then the other, and finally it rested pointing towards the portly Oriental who sat to the right of the dead man. Then the hand vanished, the shade of Mandarin Wang disappeared in the shadows of the room, then silence, unbroken even by breathing it seemed, grew denser with the passing seconds. The three Chinamen still drank their tea, before them the empty chair where the spirit of Mandarin Wang had sat. All three were staring at the teapot, for they well knew what it meant. The nozzle was pointed at the heart of the son of Mandarin Wang. The elder Chinaman with the gray hair reached down into the sleeve of his robe and drew from it a wondrous piece of carved ivory about 7 inches long, traced upon it the most delicate flowers with tiny twisted dragons wound among the blossoms. With his long forefinger and thumb he separated the ivory stick, and from the hollow of its case drew a fine steel dagger which he laid upon the table top, its blade pointing with the nozzle of the teapot. Then lifting up the wonderful porcelain container he filled his cup again and sank back in his chair. A few minutes later, having finished this last cup, he rose, and with him rose the other two. Crossing his hands in his sleeves he bowed low to his companions. The Chinaman with the drooping mustache also folded his arms, while the son of Mandarin Wang inclined his head also in dignified salutation. The two Chinamen then passed slowly from the room, leaving the teapot and the dagger on the table. The son of Mandarin Wong sat down in the chair facing the porcelain nozzle with the flaming bird traced upon it. Then taking the dagger in his hand, he played with it for several seconds. A shadow of gloom seemed to pass over the room, the lantern swayed, the floor heaved and twisted, the great teapot grew larger and larger before his eyes. Lights danced in many colors, and before him stood the face and form of Mandarin Wong, his yellow hands upon the teapot lid. Then slowly things grew dark and darker around him. A great shadow descended, and without a sound the son of Mandarin Wong fell forward, his head resting upon the tabletop, in his heart the dagger of justice, driven by his own hand. The gleam of the lantern still shone down, and it fell upon the black-robed form of the Chinaman, his head deathly still upon the table. It fell upon the carvings where his fingers had played but a few minutes before. It shed a faint light upon the body which lay upon the teakwood couch nearby, but it shone and gleamed mostly upon the teapot, whose accusing nozzle still pointed at the heart of the son of Mandarin Wong. The voice. This is a little story that might have been. It concerns one Giovanni Cini, of whom one must hear more to better understand this story. Giovanni was called the Ape Man, for he was a strange creature with great misshapen head and body twisted and bent, long arms that swung nearly to the ground, a hunched back and legs that had never grown but, short and thick like those of a gorilla, carried him along a strange shuffling walk. When children saw him they ran in fear and trembling, while grown people shuddered as he came by. Giovanni had never been wanted. His family, one of the greatest in Italy, had him carried away when just a baby and brought up among beggar folks and thieves. The mutilations of his body were the results of attempts to destroy his little life before he was born, and now, like some strange demoniacal ogre, he wandered around. Even the dogs and beasts loathed him, and when he put out his great gaunt, misshapen hand to pet them they ran away howling, their tails between their legs. He grew up in dirt and squalidness, could neither read nor write, and his life seemed a curse to all with whom he came in contact. His foster parents were paid great sums of money to keep his identity unknown, for if the world had known who he was he would have been heir to one of the highest titles in the land. His mind was like that of a child, for the deformity of his body was reflected in his brain. But Giovanni was strangely different from the deformed appearance of his body, for while his form spoke of violence and hate, his mind and soul were full of love and charity to all living things. He lived his life alone, for none would go near save with beats and cuffs. He was a sad, broken thing who could never know friendship or have one soul in whom he could confide his childish tale of woe. Giovanni was a grown man now, but all through his life, even to the time when death shall close his eyes forever, he will be a child. He loved to go out from the city into the meadows and valleys beyond and pick flowers, for flowers were the only things that did not run away from him. But he sighed, for even these seemed to wither at his touch. Gaunt and uncouth, Giovanni Cini wandered the earth, walking in the gutter and living with dogs and swine. He never knew why his body was distorted, of the cruel blows that sought to kill it. All he knew was that he was different from other things, was lonely and misunderstood. One day, cowering away from the stones and sticks which the village youths threw at him, his cheeks wet with tears and his heart aching beyond expression, he came to the door of a little church in whose shrine dim tapers burned. As he huddled, broken-hearted, on the steps, an old man came out, dressed in a long gray robe, and for the first time in his life Giovanni Cini heard a kind word. A hand was laid upon his shoulder, tenderly this time, and the poor boy looked up in amazement, for never in all his life had he known a soft touch. An old gray-haired man with a kindly face and a sweet smile gazed at him. "Why do you weep here?" he asked the wondering youth. "They all throw sticks and stones and tell the dogs to chase me because, oh, I am so hideous." And the youth held out his long misshapen arms with their claw-like fingers. "No one cares for me, they all hate me. They tell me they wish I had never been born, and oh, how I wish I could die." The old man leaned over and helped the youth to his feet. "Come with me, my son, for when the world shall cast you down, then your God shall pick you up. Here none shall come to laugh at you, for there is a place far in the mountains which is called the Monastery of Sorrow. All who dwell in those stony cells have sorrow in their souls, broken hearts, broken bodies, and the cruelty of the world has forced them therein. There alone they sit to write and meditate. When you are tired of wandering these streets, you may go there to rest, for at this place all will be kind to you and help you to forget the coldness of the world. When you are ready to go into these mountains, come and tell me." "Father, I am ready now," answered the youth, rising on his short dwarfed legs. He turned his horrid face with its discolored teeth and flattened nose up to the priest, and, clasping the hem of the father's robe, he sobbed, "I am ready now, Father, take me away. No one cares for me here, there are none to even ask. Take me away to the country where the flowers are, for they are the only things that do not run from me in fear." "I am not afraid of you," answered the priest, putting his arm around the dwarfed figure, "nor is God afraid of you. Come with me and I will send you to the Monastery of Sorrow, where you can spend the rest of your life in nature, in prayer and meditation, and in peace." Throwing his great cape about the figure, which toddled by his side, the priest entered the ancient church, and the great door closed behind him. Giovanni Cini thus disappeared from the sight of the world and was never seen again. In a distant land there is a great cathedral where people come to hear a voice. Some say that it is the voice of God, but none know what it really is. Each Sunday there breaks forth upon the air a song. It comes from behind a grating of curtained partitions and wells out with the strangest notes that ever mortal ear listened to. It is the voice of Fra Celestius, the great monk. 5 notes higher than high C, that voice rises, higher even than the fine notes of a bird, then it swells out in thundering baritone and bass, a voice without limit, high or low. It was called the God voice in man. From all over the world people came to hear that wondrous singer that no man had ever seen. The penitent came to pray, and sinners renounced their lives of crime as those notes hung upon the air. The very glory of God Himself was sung in that voice, which woke memories that were dead, revived hopes that were broken, gave peace to the sad of heart. The sick came on their crutches, the halt and the blind, and as that voice sounded their eyes were opened, their ears were made to hear, and the halt of their tongues was loosened. They cast down their crutches, and rose from beds of sickness under the divine inspiration of the voice. From across the sea there came an artist. Day after day he came to the great cathedral to gain the inspiration for a masterpiece of art, and then returning to his studio painted the painting of a voice. It was a glorious canvas. In the center was a heavenly figure, as perfect as a Greek god, with eyes upraised and hands spread as though to grasp the infinite creation. The mouth was open, singing, and the air was filled with winged figures that seemed to pour an endless stream from his mouth. Into this the artist put all of his soul, and when it was finished he called the picture Fra Celestis the Voice. A great one came to see him one day, an old man in a gray cowl. The artist showed him the picture, saying, "Is it not wonderful, the dream, the inspiration that I gained from that voice? What a beautiful man that singer must be." The monk nodded his head. "Beautiful indeed," he answered softly. "Come with me next Sunday and I will show you the singer." On the next Sabbath, the artist and his gray cowl-led friend entered the church by a side door and stood where they could look down upon the niche where the singer stood. As they waited there a form stepped into the niche, concealed from below by the heavy draperies. The artist stepped back in amazement. "My God! That can't be he. Not the Fra Celestis." In the niche stood a short deformed figure in the gray robe of a monk, with long arms like those of an ape, a strange fierce face and distorted body, unfinished or broken in the making. A few seconds later the mouth opened. A beautiful soprano note hung in the air and a hush fell over the church. "Indeed, brother, that is he," said the monk. In the world he was Giovanni Cini the manager, now he is Fra Celestis, whose voice sings as the birds of the sky, whose heart is as sweet and soul as pure as the notes he sings. You drew a wonderful painting, Signor. You drew not this body of Giovanni Cini, you drew his soul. Listen. How can such notes as those come from such a broken heap of clap? Ah, brother, the old man crossed himself. God works indeed in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. Someday yonder brother will be a saint, while you and I are still sinners. Sold. But, mother, he's old enough to be my father, and besides I don't even know him. Why should I tie myself to an old man like that? I could never learn to love him. My dear child, you must get that foolish idea of sentiment out of your head. Children do not marry for love nowadays, but for the general good of the whole family. Dr. Ricks is a wonderful match for you, and according to the Blue Book he is one of the richest men in the city. Why, he's worth millions, and is so old he can't live very long anyway. My dear, this is the chance of your life. Think what it will mean to all of us. It will mean that I, your mother, will again be surrounded by those comforts and conditions she has been accustomed to, but which your late father by his foolish sentimentalism made impossible by giving his money away to beggars. But mother, I don't want to marry an old man who is so sick and dissipated he can hardly walk. It is true that he is rather old to be eligible, but if you will think carefully you will realize that he is entirely too eligible to be considered old. If you do not think of yourself, think of your mother and the needs of her old age. Do you want her to live in some little country town all her life on the paltry pittance of your father's run-down estate, not even sufficient to supply us with a servant? Mother, why do you keep after me day after day, month after month, when you know it is breaking my heart? Because, child, this is not a matter of your heart, it is purely a matter of business. Dr. Ricks is madly in love with you. Anything you ask for he will give you, and the future and happiness of the entire family depends upon your marriage to this man. Mother, I cannot. I will not marry that old tottering man and his dotage. It would hie a lie before God and man, a crime. I will not sell myself for his money." "Tut, tut, my dear. You have not lived as long as I have, or you would realize that I am giving you good advice, and what is more, I expect you to follow it." "I will not. Edith Marlowe, it is my command that you marry Dr. Ricks. I am your mother, and my word must be your law." Mrs. Marlowe rose to her feet, her jaw set like a vise of steel and her eyes glinty with anger. She was a handsome woman with a tall, stately figure and gray hair, but the expression on her face was that of an empress demanding obedience. She ruled her home with a rod of iron, feared by her children whose spirits she had broken and whose lives she was bent on twisting into her own channel. The daughter looked at her mother for a few seconds, and then her head, with its mass of tousled and disheveled brown hair, fell before the piercing eyes of her mother. Tears were in the girl's eyes, and slowly she sank to her knees, clasping her mother's hands. "Mother, mother! I will do anything in the world to please you, for I love you with all my heart." And she turned her big brown eyes, wet with weeping, to her mother's face. "But you can't ask me to sacrifice my whole life in such a way. Mother, don't look at me like that. I can't do it. I will kill myself first." "Nonsense, child. Get up and behave yourself. Remember what your father said. Children, obey your parents, and if you love me you will keep my commandments. I command you to marry this man for the good of the whole family, for your own sake and for mine also. For months you have tortured me with that demand, but mother, I shall never marry Dr. Ricks, and that is final." Mrs. Marlowe drew herself up and glared at her daughter, her face white with rage and her lips like two thin lines of purple. "You shall marry Dr. Ricks. I have already arranged it, and when he calls this evening you will become engaged to him. Do you understand? Now go to your room and remain there until he comes or until I call you. This is once where your mother is going to have things done the way she demands them. Now go." Edith Marlowe passed slowly from the room, her shoulders bent and her breath coming in short sobs. Reaching the door, she turned around with a look of desperation in her eyes. "Mother, you shall regret this someday." Turning, she ran up the stairs. Mrs. Marlowe stood for several seconds undecided, striking the palm of one hand with the fist of the other. She was a woman of the world, a woman of ambition, and she had reared her daughter for one purpose alone: to fulfill her craving for riches, and at any price she would obtain her end. Her white head rose, and she became again the Dowager Empress, a woman bringing over from some past life the power of a breaker of men, in soul and in spirit one of Caesar's legions. The moments passed, the great clock on the stairs ticked out, and the dull gong told of a passing hour. Mrs. Marlowe sat down. "She must, she shall, obey me. I have spent thousands of dollars on her education. I have brought her into the best society, and all this for naught? No. My happiness depends upon her making a successful match. If she marries Dr. Ricks, I can have my private car and a home. I shall not miss this opportunity." The gloom of evening. No sound broke the stillness save the old clock. Finally Mrs. Marlowe rose, her face now set in repose, and pressing the switch flooded the room with light. She looked about carefully to see that everything was in order, for this was one of the most important moments of her life. That evening Dr. Ricks was to call. The moments passed while through the mother's mind schemes of the future were passing, schemes centered around her own ambition, absolutely thoughtless of her daughter's heart of woe. Then the ring of the doorbell sounded and, rising, Mrs. Marlowe passed with Georgian dignity into the hallway and opened the door to admit Dr. Robert Ricks. He was a little short, dry-looking man of about 72 years of age. His complexion was the color of paste and his entire system was permeated with scrofula and nicotine poisoning. He had been married 4 times. 2 of his wives had left him and the others had died. He spoke in a high, sharp voice and looked through old-fashioned gold-rimmed glasses at Mrs. Marlowe. "Good evening, madam. I have come in reply to your note. Am I to understand that my plea for the hand of your daughter has found favor in your sight? This delights me." Mrs. Marlowe closed the door behind the doctor, her eyes turning with envy to the beautiful automobile that waited before the door with chauffeur and footman in livery. "Come in, Dr. Ricks, and sit down. Here, let me take your hat and cane." Seated across the living room table from each other, Dr. Ricks and Mrs. Marlowe discussed the plan which their older heads had framed between them. "I am fascinated by your charming daughter," squeaked Dr. Ricks. "Can it be that my charms have found favor in her sight?" "I know she thinks very highly of you, Doctor," lied Mrs. Marlowe sweetly, "but you know the child is very young and hasty yet. However, I think we can come to a very amicable understanding on the subject. But there are 2 or 3 little things that must be considered. If I allow my daughter to marry you, I must have $500,000. "You shall," answered Dr. Ricks eagerly. "Gladly shall you have it. I would give all I possess for her." "Then that is settled," answered Mrs. Marlowe. "Will you please make that out on paper, Doctor, so that we will have no misunderstanding later?" "Better than that, madam. Here is my check." And with a shaky hand the doctor filled one out. "I will announce the engagement at once. She shall marry you the 1st of next month. Doctor, this is one of the greatest moments of my life. At last, after years of poverty, I shall again occupy my proper position in society. This is the happiest moment I have known in years." Mrs. Marlowe looked up and there, standing with her back against the door, stood Edith Marlowe, a strange expression in her face which her mother had never seen there before. "Good evening, Miss Marlowe." Rising with difficulty, the old doctor stood. "It is a charming evening." Miss Marlowe did not look at him at all, but her face was turned to her mother. "Mother," she said slowly in a voice which seemed strangely different, "I have come to say 2 or 3 things to you, and you must listen to them. You have just signed on that table a paper which is to sell my life and soul to another. You say it is in the scripture, 'Children, obey your parent.' But it also says in the scripture, 'Parents, provoke not your children to wrath.' You have ruined my life, broken my hopes, shattered my soul, all for the sake of your own social position. You brought me into the world for no other reason than to sell me. But you do not own the soul of me, you but own the clay that you have broken. Life already stretched before me in the path that I had chosen to go, a path which is reasonable and true. I had already chosen one who was to walk that path with me, but he was poor and you would not have him and turned him away to sell me to another. You are but one of many mothers whose eyes gaze longingly at their children's form, waiting until they are old enough to turn them into gold. From out of the infinite they came to you to love and cherish. You have sold God's gifts to you, you have blasphemed His plan, you have prostituted His offering like so many others have. Almost all the daughters who come into the world are for sale to the highest bidder, but you shall never own me, nor will you ever own the soul of another living thing. This old man, broken in body, too old for you even to consider, you would sell him to me and me to him. Well, sell that which was yours to sell, it is not much. At that instant the sound of footsteps, heavy boot treads, sounded on the porch of the little house, and a ring came at the door. Mrs. Marlowe rose, a strange expression on her face, her eyes fastened to the accusing ones of her child, and slowly reaching the door threw it open. Into the room came 4 figures, 2 men in rubber boots soaked with water. In their arms they carried a third, while a youth, wild-eyed and disheveled, followed up the rear. "Mrs. Marlowe, I believe," said one of the men as he lifted the covering off his burden. "We have just dragged the body of your daughter out of the river at the dam. She must have fallen, and I guess she has been dead about 3 or 4 hours." "Impossible," staring around. "Standing there, against the door," exclaimed Mrs. Marlowe. "There's my daughter." She pointed to the figure. Edith Marlowe pointed her hand to the white, water-soaked figure in the arms of the dam-keeper. "That, mother, is yours to buy and sell. On the altars of ambition lie the bodies of the slain, youth and love together martyred in the cause of human gain. Life and limb are bartered freely as the golden shekels flow, while misery lurks in the shadow of each deadly hammer blow. What is offered? Sounds the call, sorrow's song through every age lives for gold, youth for silver, and misery for the hammer's wage. Thus are hopes forever slaughtered at the auction block of gain, rosy cheeks are turned to ashen, noble lives by greed are slain. Mothers, fathers of the races sell not children's hearts for gold. They have come as trusts from heaven, not for profits bought or sold, and the curse of all the ages rests on those who buy and sell the lives and hearts of living creatures to chain them in ambition's hell. Going, how much is offered? Still the trader plays his trade, the old buy youth, the rich buy beauty. The devil buys the soul, 'tis said. The laughing eyes grow dim with sorrow, singing voices wail instead. Youthful souls are aged with sorrow and seek peace among the dead. Sons and daughters buy them here, your worthiness is proved by price. The highest bidder owns the soul, while death wins all with loaded dice. Gone, another soul is butchered for some ambitious parent's scheme. Gone, another life is ruined, broken is its golden dream. But above the sadness brooding a single star of light still gleams, for the spirit flees to freedom from the wreckage of its dreams. The God who loves his children buys each heart that's sold, they say, and those who pawn and sell his children barter only lumps of clay. Spiritual healing. How far should a healer go in his attempt to reconstruct the physical body of a suffering patient? Is the exercise of occult force and healing permissible? How are we going to judge accurately the needs of patients? These are very important questions, as healing is one of the most prominent phases of occult work. The ancient Rosicrucian order formed for the purpose of healing the sick, and the 18th degree of Freemasonry stands for the exercising of the power of the great physician. We may safely say that healing is a constructive work, but certain elements are necessary before it is safe for the occult student to exert his powers in that direction. The average occult and metaphysical healer does more harm than good. The realization of the existence of a cure of 10 encourages intemperance, thoughtlessness, and carelessness in the soul of the average individual. Consequently, the doctrine of forgiveness, the power of consciousness over karma, and similar ideas are not, generally speaking, safe concepts to give to the world, because these teachings fail to dwell upon the most important point of all: prevention. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure in every case. And occultists who are always teaching ways to escape from dilemma rather than ways to keep out of trouble are not doing the work of the elder brothers in the world. Before a person attempts to become a healer, he or she must be in a position to answer several questions which the average psychotherapist knows absolutely nothing about. First of all, am I or am I not a thorough anatomist and physicist? A scientific education is as important to an occult healer as it is to a student of Materna Medica. Occult healing is not faith healing. Occult healing is scientific, depending upon an accurate knowledge of universal law and the knowledge of how to manipulate these laws until they break up various etheric and astral combinations in the bodies of man. The occult physician knows every bone and muscle of the body, while the average so-called healer knows little, if anything, concerning the constitution of man. It is possible that such persons will secure results, but they are not healers. They are mediums who must accept conditions as external powers dictate, and they are not healers who manipulate these powers at will. The second requisite is, an occult healer must be able to analyze the cause of ailment, tracing it, if necessary, back 7 or 8 incarnations to find out why the patient is suffering today. Most healers try to heal everybody, and in this way again do more harm than good. It is just as much of a detriment for some people to be well as it is for others to be sick. Health and sickness are problems to be solved by the ego itself, and when outside intelligences seek to solve these problems, the result is detriment rather than advantage to the consciousness. Around us there are many healers who know nothing of natural law, do not know whether the patient deserves the sickness or not. They try to heal every ailment, sometimes battling straight in the face of karma, natural law, and the plan of the evolution of that consciousness. Such a course is hopelessly detrimental, and many people who have been thus healed of their ailments have wasted their entire incarnation, for they have not learned to be any better or stronger themselves. The third qualification of a healer is that they should realize the source of their power and know that this power is given them to use in accordance with the plan of being. When they attempt to exert their will power over the plan, they destroy their usefulness as healers. The old doctrine used to be, "Come and be saved. Lean on the Lord and let other people do it." The average so-called healing case is just a metaphysical expression of this idea. What good is there for a healer to concentrate for perfect digestion over an individual who is living an unbalanced, intemperate life and whose every action causes the ailment which he is seeking to relieve himself of? The average person who comes to a healer for help should be given a bath, a dose of good common sense, and sent back to clean up. They come with 25 years of accumulation of mental, physical, and spiritual filth, looking for miracles, when what they need is soap and water inside and out. There is no greater expression of bunkum in occultism than the healing side. In the hands of the great initiate or the authorized representative of a great spiritual work, or a disciple who has seen the plan of being, healing is a normal person with a little psychic ability comes along and heals them of something that they never earned the right to get well from. Cults and creeds which preach peace, health, and happiness as the result of inertia or somebody else's effort are not spiritual, sensible, rational, or worthy of any consideration. Very miraculous thing, for all of his efforts are to swing the patient in line with natural law and assist him to assist himself. A dear friend of ours has 2 little children out in front of the average healer's office whom she is raising like little wildflowers. You can find them lined up: chilblains, gout, lilies of the valley, and so forth. First they locomotor ataxia, tumors, scrofula, eczema, were creepers, now they are runners, and later dropsy, scabies, and barber's itch. They will blossom forth with all the beauty come with their tales of woe when all that of uncultured wild flowers. They are surely most of them need is to clean up. If the daisies even at this point in the game and the healer does do anything for them, they just neighbors know them as forget-me-nots. Like turn around and get sick again. It is a thank flowers they do not bathe, but unlike flowers less, hopeless, helpless, job because the healer they do not stand out in the rain. She neither is as foolish as the patient, corrects them, nor bends the youthful twig, but occult healing should only be resorted to as letting God take care of them. The reward under 2 conditions. First, when all come for this is that they are positively the greatest nonsense methods have failed. Second, nuisance of their size in 10 counties. When the disease is of an occult nature such one tries to correct them, the mother goes into his obsession, attacks from black magicians, hysterics, claiming that they are God's perfect. To be sure, occult methods will help all feet children and are without sin. They diseases hut. The first requisite of occultism is throwing tin cans at the cat, rubs soap on the individual himself should make a downs, fall into the cistern and play marbles, conscientious effort, and under general con on your roof. They cuss like troopers and they get well when they make this, and little Willie, aged 5, has already touched do not need healing. The depth of smokers' degeneracy. These 2 to encourage individuals to believe that little wild flowers with a daffodil for the Lord decreed them perfect health is fool mother, spent a day a little while ago in Setish. They may enjoy perfect health when ting fire to an automobile, ringing doorbells they behave themselves, otherwise they will in stealing the Sunday newspapers. They not. The Lord decrees that also. A healer are the examples of those sweet simple child who makes an automatic profession out of his dream, who grow up like little blossoms on a work is a curse to occult science. The philosophy of the absolute. There are 2 kinds of people in the world: people with a vision and people without a vision. Those people with a vision who claim to have surrounded the absolute are those without a vision. So first of all, let us take up an argument in defense of the absolute. If any human creature knows all there is to know, the absolute is not very wise, because the more we hear about him from his disciples among men, the more foolish traits, the more idiosyncrasies, and more lopsidedness we find attributed to him. The man who says I know all there is to know is making either a fool out of God or an egotist out of himself. We have a large group of people who are personal friends of the infinite, have been properly introduced to the unknowable and spend their weekends, heads, in conflab with the definitionless abstract. There are several types of people who know this absolute. Some of them are inclusive and some of them are exclusive. We have a certain amount of patience for the inclusive absoluter, but the exclusive absoluter excludes the absolute. It is this certain group of people who are not even willing to know what God knows, and have long left such ordinary ignoramuses as the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost far in the rear. They speed by the cosmic logos in their 12-cylinder Rolls-Royce with a ta to the universal creation. They glide by 82,000 hierarchies of devas, chohans, mahakahans, and rishis without even condescending to consider them. They step from star to star, leaving thin trail of blue smoke behind them from the exhaust of their intercosmic velocipede. Said tailstream is now called the Milky Way. They are headed for the footstool of all there is, dissolved in all that is not. They are true star-rovers, with apologies to Jack London. The gods of their fellow men are pygmies unworthy to notice. They have found that which is not, yet is and ever shall be. Their mind is dissolved into unison with the cosmic void, and they have attuned their body and consciousness to the low-pressure area of the Absolute. They no longer worry as to what they shall eat, nor what they shall wear, nor how they shall speak, nor in whatsoever manner they shall perpetuate themselves or propel their personality. Their minds are on the mystic ethers of the divine, as naught else will interest them nor fill the aching void between their ears. They are the living contradictors of visible and tangible things. They have made the solidity of nature a vacuum, while they have asphalted the absolute and made of the abstract a solid concrete deity as brainless as they are. Now let us take a careful analysis of the mental caliber of the star rover and find who composes these seers and sages who have left creation to its own destruction and sailed to salvation on the pinions of their mentality, mostly opinions. We will analyze the stock which flavors of the divine wisdom of ages, like onions flavor soup, those people who have become tired of terrestrial things and who consider the universe to be the divine failure and they the successes. One of our leading absoluters, who has shaken hands with a non-existing entity and has defined the depth of LS not, is Mrs. Patricia Murphy, whose husband runs the local barber shop. Mrs. Murphy was born with a vision. She does not know the occipital frontalis muscle from the Latin word for broom handle, but in spite of this she has the vision. She has not the slightest idea of what God has ever done, but she knows him personally. She has told a number of her friends that she has traced French pastry hack to the first outpouring and is quite confident that the Absolute's gray whiskers are made of icing. This is her total idea of the Absolute. She does not know the meaning of any of the episodes that surround her in life. She has been careful not to consider them for fear that she might be enveloped in the veil of Maya and lose her personal touch with the abstract. Her idea of the Absolute is a large round dark hole, for she has absolutely nothing in her own brain to fill it with. But she admits that there is such a hole, and by so doing becomes saved. The second member of this celestial trinity we are considering in our little spasm is Gluck McFag, a well-known disciple of things vacuumized. He has come into the light by realizing that there is not any, and by so doing has proved that there is. This is a little problem in celestial mathematics based upon the fact that if you have something, it isn't, while if you lose it comes back. Undoubtedly Pythagoras would have enjoyed this system. In other words, we glorify God by proving that His manifestations are foolishness. We worship Him as an individual who spends all his time making mistakes and filling the universe with a series of unnecessary nonentities that through them we might learn how good He is. Other mathematical problem with apologies to Euclid. But let us return to this error of the mortal mind commonly known as Gluck McFag. According to all the lights of absolute reasoning, Gluck does not exist at all, and not being himself is capable of being blended into the eternal vacuum. Socrates, we believe, attempted to solve the problem in the same way but finally got so twisted up that he took hemlock so he could have another brain a little later. He lost the brain he had trying to find a round hole in the center of a depthless opening. Gluck is our leading haberdasher and necktie vendor. He sells collar buttons, arch supporters and imported suspenders with great ease and fluency, and is considered a leading light in the affairs of earth. He not a very highly educated man. One day a friend came up to him and said, "Gluck, give us your definition of the absolute," whereupon he opened the front door and threw his chest out and with great gusto gave a scintillating description of Henry J. Ain't, commonly known as the absolute. The absolute, says Gluck, is that ever-existing emptiness surrounded by its own outpouring, all of which are unreal. The center of this emptiness is in the middle and around the edge, while it is bordered by its own commencement. Whereupon said friend was deeply impressed. "What does it look like?" he asked then. "In order to see it," was the answer, "you must close your eyes in a dark room and look at the inside of the lids." "Is it intelligent?" asked the friend. No, said Gluck, "intelligence is all illusionary. If it had the power of reason it would be false, if it could see it would be unreal." I think I grasp its import. In other words, it is but it isn't. Answered Gluck, "your powers of erudition are in perfect line with the reality of things. I talk with the Absolute every night." "How do you do it?" marveled the man. "Why, I come into the realization that what is not, and what's left afterwards is." Said friend was duly impressed, bought a 5-cent collar button and called it a day. The crowning glory of our trinity of unrealities is Professor Alpha Epsilon, the one who has impregnated the community with this divine misunderstanding. El Frani Facie is the branch of mistletoe which hangs above the arch of spiritual wisdom, the original discoverer of the Absolute. Someone came along and out-absolute him, whereupon he blossomed forth with the super-absolute, which is the dot in the center of the hole in the middle of the blank. If anyone out-supers him, he will probably discover the absolute which has not been bothered with yet, being the hole in the center of the dot, which is the center of the vacuum surrounded by the blank of the previous chapter. Professor Epsilon has a falling upper palmate and a celluloid collar. When he moves, like Mark Twain, he travels in a cigar box. Professor Epsilon is the one who can tell you all about something which he admits does not exist and is the only real thing because it does not exist. We think our friend Diogenes must have been looking for this a while ago, but we understand his light went somewhere along the line. Professor will bring you into union with is, and if you will cross his palm with is, the exchange of is being absolutely important to the realization of isn't. Professor Epsilon is the keeper of the vehicular at the lower end of which we start on our choice journey to the upper end, which is resting upon a hypothetical vacuum. Professor Epsilon is in a position to express himself upon the reality of things because he has learned to know the folly of knowledge, and his first great instruction is that to think is excessively dangerous to the realization of the plan, because if pursued this path will speedily separate you from him, which would result in a decline in his finance. Professor Epsilon is a master of abstraction, but the greatest abstraction which he is capable of doing is to abstract money from a sealed pocketbook. Now, what is the philosophy of the true absolute? Let us analyze this problem in a rational, sensible manner. Every time an individual has an idea these days, he forms a new religion. Every time he has two ideas, T splits up and fights itself, so nothing reasonable is ever arrived at. The absolute is not a new discovery, and the existence of the supreme unformed as the hypothetical base of formation is accepted in every religion of the world. Undoubtedly there is an absolute cause, the perfect base of impermanence palm roll, which all things came and to which they shall return, therein completing the gamut of their existence. The abstract is the divine Atma, the definition-less base of all definable things. From the invisible cause all pour the shadow shapes of effects which play out in the world of mortality, the divine chess game of the infinite. Why were these sparks projected into matter? Why is the universe peopled with great hierarchies of evolving individualities, which Spencer called the infinite diversities of unity? Is not this the battlefield upon which man learns to know one little stage, one little step in his ultimate growth? Who then knows the absolute in fullness save him who is the master of the gamut of his manifestations? Who shall know the reality save the reality itself? There is an absolute God, the changeless base of ever-changing expression, neither male nor female nor both, neither high nor low nor both. This infinite cause all, this self-knowing one, who yet recognizes himself only through his manifestation, this one is the absolute. He is to man absolutely unattainable, for between him and man's consciousness there is a void, a gap, which 82,000 hierarchies of celestial beings cannot span. The gods of solar systems and the gods of cosmic schemes themselves know not the light nor the source thereof. The doctrine of the absolute is a true one, but it is one of those truths which is worthless at this stage of evolution. There is no constructive application for it, for there is no sense of consciousness in the soul of man that is capable of even knowing the hem of its garment, let alone to grasp its magnificence. If someone told you they had 1 billion pennies and another told you they had 5 billion pennies, what picture would you have in your mind? All you could say is that one had more than another. Man is incapable of mentally differentiating between 1 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion, a septillion or a quintillion. It is just a lot more, that is all. When we try to realize that in this cosmos of ours there are more solar systems, universes, chains, globes and spheres than there are atoms in the bodies of creation, then it looks rather big. They are not counted by octillions, they are counted by 100 octillions of octillions, and many times that. The Milky Way is made up of universes many times larger than our own, each tiny spark a chain containing limitless evolving atoms. What child is there born of earth capable of expressing or knowing or imagining the qualities of the limitless intelligence that governs these things? The human mind is absolutely incapable of attempting the struggle. To try to define the absolute is to defile it and to deny it. The dreaming savior, saint or sage is unworthy even to whisper it. Gods themselves dare not breath it, for even his eldest sons have never lifted the hem of his mantle. And yet there are people who might be respectable burglars, which would be infinitely superior to being disreputable burglars which they are at the present time, who rave about that of which they know not, and cast lots for garments that gods dare not dream of. With the puny intelligence of a grain of sand they seek to show the stuff that gods are made of. It is a foolish waste of time, and if persisted in will inevitably result in insanity of the brain, is not capable of juggling such tremendous units of intelligence. There is but one path by which the absolute may be reached, and that is by following the winding stairs of human progress, upward and upward, until finally it achieves union with its source of being. The labors of man in this world period are not to produce gods, but to produce human beings, and the student of the Absolute would be far better off if he would try to be a credit to the human race instead of spending his time trying to discredit the unknowable. He does the best he can, but he cannot find in the universe that which he is not. Therefore the Absolute becomes full of whims and fancies placed there by those who seek to know him but could only reflect from his subtle shield their own souls. The world needs people to be truly human, to learn how to master and express the truly concrete qualities which we are here to build. We must have the dreamer and the sage, but he must dream dreams to serve his brother man and not try to build with his own feeble imagination a creature which even gods dare not to imagine. Our modern thought is wandering from the field of practical things into the vistas of impracticality. If we are to attain the acme of this race, let us realize that to be perfect human beings is the ultimate of our goal, and that godhood is not the perfection of human beings. The most glorious concept in the world today is the concept of the perfect man. That dream is attainable. By labors it may be made practical, by conscientious living it becomes a reality. And if people who spend their time quoting the isness of AM would leave their intellectual stimulants alone and go out into the world to manifest the isness of their own spiritual consciousness by being cleaner, better, and truer than their brother man, the Absolute would be perfectly able to take care of itself. 100 million years from now, with his greatest effort, man will only be a shade closer to the infinite. But that shade is everything, for an eternity time is dissolved in works. And still the Absolute remains veiled in the mantle of his own obscurity, untouched, unfathomed, and undreamed of by those who call his name but do not know his spirit. He slumbers in the infinite void of being, the baseless all. In him the worlds spin and move while man dwells as an atom in his formless body. Worlds and universes are but cells in his endless being, and no man shall ever know him, for he is wrapped in the robes of his own omnipotence. 'Tis blasphemy to strive to rend this garment, a blasphemy which gods dare not assail, but man, puny in his own strength but great in his egotism, assails to do that which gods do fear, and is a fool to walk the path where wise men dare not tread. He could walk to the ends of chaos, and yet the sweeping folds of the infinite would remain concealed. His duty is not to unveil the Absolute, but to nourish and feed one little spark within his own soul. That labor is too great for him. Why then should he assail the wheel from which the sparks are born? As he cannot temper the steel of his own spirit, Why should he attempt to wield the sledgehammers of Vulcan? His own character is more than he can govern. Why then should he seek to govern the infinite? His modesty is his strongest virtue, and those who assail to storm the temple of the Absolute are shorn of their virginity and are gowned in the robes of egotism. Let the Absolute slumber in its death-like stillness. Let the unknowable remain unmoved in his meditations, for his meditations are the universes and worlds dropping as pearls from his lips. Let the servant be found among men to carry on the work of keeping these pearls in sanctity and reverence, worrying not of their source. For how shall man, with a mind of matter, carry the thoughts of eternity and live? Close down the veil, lest passing through too soon the flame should destroy all. Teach man to live, to love, to labor and to grow. Teach him to better fulfill the labors of the lesser and leave in the hands of the infinite that which he alone can know and master. These thoughtless words of things we know not of brand us only fools. The lightness of our tone as we speak of nature's deepest mystery proves us unworthy of the trust. For the Absolute is in all, is all, will be all that ever shall be. Gods, men and worlds are whispered words from his mouth wrapped in the veils of matter. No mortal eye shall gaze upon its depth, but as the presence of this being draws ever nearer, man shall sink into a depthless sleep, and there be one with the Father of all, whom he may not know, but in whose arms he shall never cease to be. Copyright 2025 by Manly Hall Official. Thank you for listening. Please consider to subscribe, like, and share to help the channel growth. New videos on a daily basis.